Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars podcast. Now, you and I all know the name Alexander Mikaberidze, and we know full well that if we had him on this show every time he published something, he would have blocked us by now, because he would never have time to teach. God knows how he has time to teach anyway, given the amount that he publishes. But when he and Doyna Hassanyi released an edited volume through Palgrave Macmillan, we sit up and take notice. So with the release of Napoleonic governance and the integration of Europe, which I think we're still trying for, we decided to bring them both on the show, and they were kind enough to come and join us.
It's somewhat ironic that we have a Brit as part of the interview team on this one. Thank you, Bo. For actually been listening to the voice of Dr. Luke Memory Reynolds, the Bo, the scholar in residence, and whatever titles I've bestowed upon him but since forgotten about. But it is somewhat ironic to have a Brit on a show talking about the integration of Europe, given the exit, the much publicized exit of the UK from Europe, and a growing debate about whether or not Britain will seek to reintegrate with the European Union. But this is a joy of an episode. To what extent was Napoleon successful in integrating Europe? It's a big debate that often comes up, and it's often sort of touted as, Napoleon was a man of the future and he was trying to create a new European Union, which I always sort of look at and go, I have questions about that. So very interested to look into the nitty gritty of this. Joining us for this one, you've heard already, we have Alexander Mikaberidze, who is, I'm going to call him the Lord High Commissioner of all things Napoleonic at this point, because why not just make up fancy titles for him? You know and love him from not only this show, but also the Napoleonic Quarterly, where he is a regular guest. Much love to that show. Alex, great to see you again. Have I managed to make your ears burn in the shortest possible time there?
No, actually, I think I'm getting used to that. In fact, I'm surprised you're not doing kowtows or some kind of ceremonial. Maybe I should insist on that from now on.
So we could try and revive a kind of cult of personality around the Napoleonic era and make you the figurehead for that. But that's something that we can look into. I'm sure we can kind of get your face emblazoned on T-shirts, and
Do you have a podcast crown that I can crown myself with, or
we can have conversations about this. Although I am the emperor of this podcast, so there risks being a war of two emperors if you then seek to crown yourself as well.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I appreciate both of you for your time and for invitation. So thank you.
Also joining us is Doyna. Sorry, Doyna, I didn't check the pronunciation before.
Don't worry about that. My Starbucks name is Diana, so we can go with that.
I love it.
You know what? We're going to leave that in the final edit because that's just a pearl. Doyna/Diana, apparently, in Starbucks.
If need be, yeah.
I'm going to say Hassanyi.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
That's okay. She's professor of history at Central Michigan University, and alongside her publication with Alex, she is also the author of French Rule in the States of Parma 1796 to 1814, Working with Napoleon, which is available from Palgrave Macmillan. We will, of course, stick links to our esteemed guest books in the chat. But Doyna/Diana, apparently, lovely to have you on the show for the first time. Welcome. How are things?
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And what an honor. Maybe I'll be vice emperor or something. I was trying to find myself a title between the two of you, I don't know.
Third consul?
Yeah, I don't know. Vice consul, arch treasurer, or sort of. We'll find something. I'll think of something. But thank you so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here with you, and of course with Alex. And thank you for noticing the book. We are very, very proud of it. So it's a pleasure to be here.
And rightly so. Luke, kick us off.
I'm reminded of a line from an early episode of Yes, Minister, where they mention the Napoleon Prize given by the European Union for the statesman that has given the most to Napoleonic unity since Napoleon. That is, if you don't count Hitler. So to kick us off, besides the obvious, excuse to be on our podcast, why did you put this volume together? And talk us through the different chapters and the big themes that have emerged. We like to start with the simple, easy questions.
Yeah. Doyna.
I had the pleasure of guest teaching at the University of Vienna, and I think it was in 2022. And I was teaching a Napoleon course. And if you're in Vienna, there is Napoleon everywhere, right? So you go to the battlefield, and you are seeing the exact spot where Hegel stood allegedly and said something like, "Here is the man of destiny," and so watching Napoleon, riding into town and so on. And so I was thinking it would be a good place to have a conference. And so I approached Alex Mikaberidze, who was on his way of becoming High Lord Commissioner of so that he with enormous kindness and generosity, he agreed to my scheme, and so we put together a number of, so our ideal, our dream team for a conference, and to our huge gratitude, everybody said yes. So it was easier than we expected to organize. So we went through the logistics, and then as you have seen in the list of chapters, we were fortunate to have really superb scholars joining us for the conversation. There were a couple of other eminent Napoleonic specialists that we were very grateful to host, but they were not able to revise their paper. So Michael Brewers was also part of it, and he very kindly stood on the screen for the entire. He could not, for health issues, he was not able to travel to Vienna, but he kindly stayed on the screen for the entire duration of the conference and talk to us. And it was really just an idea, and then to our huge gratitude, all our colleagues accepted, and we had this conference. And after that, well, you know how it is after a conference. You think, well, the presentations were so engaging and so good that we felt that a volume would be even better. And again, we are very grateful that almost everybody revised their papers, and the rest is this volume.
Yeah, first of all, I think if there is a author of this book, it's Doyna, since it was
too kind.
her idea, and to organize. I wouldn't even say it was a conference. I would say it was really a workshop, because each of the participants came with a topic that we wanted to discuss for the duration of the conference. So it wasn't just present and you're done, but rather it was present and then 24 scholars working in your field kind of picking it apart and providing feedback and discussing. So in this way, I think it was I would say, in my personal kind of experience, one of the most rewarding experience, because for the duration of the conference, we were able to substantively discuss a range of issues. Now, what type of issues, right? So once Doyna and I agreed that we want this kind of workshop/conference, we immediately said we don't want this to be a military-oriented or kind of political diplomatic conference, because I think there's been enough recent publications, enough kind of discussions of it, and I think me as a kind of scholar, and I'm sure Doyna too, kind of on this trajectory where increasingly you're looking at the connectiveness of all the things that we've discussed. So I'm now more interested, for example, in financial issues. The book that I'm starting right now is about the war and finance. So I want to see how Napoleonic Wars were paid for, especially from the French side. And of course, you cannot understand that without understanding the administrative nature, right, of the empire. How were resources extracted? How were the occupied territories managed? And more crucially, what was the nature of the empire that we all, whether we like it or not, whether we're on the British side, kind of working on the British side, French side, Russian or German, kind of we all have to grapple with this 800-pound gorilla that has dominated the continent. And so Doyna and I, we immediately agreed that it needs to be focused on the management of the empire. And hence why kind of when we thought about the topic or the title of the book, we agreed that it needs to be about Napoleonic governance, an attempt at integration. And of course, once you have this idea in mind, then you want to find scholars who work on similar topics and who can substantively contribute. So one of the first ones, for example, we thought of was a wonderful French historian, Aurélien Lignerot, who is not as well known in the English-speaking world, but he's absolutely incredible when it comes to the French historiography and expanding the scale of or the extent of the French historiography with regards to administrative side of the French Empire. And so he's written incredible books, including a title called The Imperials, which is a study of French or Napoleonic bureaucracy. So then we kind of looked at the other scholars, including, Jonah Jur from Netherlands and Michael Ligeri, who is currently working on the French grand strategy. So we wanted him to kind of tell us, well, what was ultimately Napoleon's goal, right? As we talk about the Napoleonic Empire. And then we had Christine Haynes, Vittorio Princi, Sam Mustafa, David Levin, and so on and on. And we can kind of look at specific chapters if we want to. But collectively, I think the goal was to evaluate Napoleonic Empire. So we didn't touch the British side as much or Russian side, but Napoleonic Empire from the periphery, really. So from Italy or German states or Spain or even Islamic world, and see both the impact but also the interaction between the empire and the periphery.
Okay, so loads of things to unpack there. One of the things that's right at the core of this is a question that you ask about the Napoleonic Empire kind of losing the war but ultimately winning the peace. So before we have a sort of fist fight over that question, which is pretty much how any conversation on those lines tends to go after about 15 minutes, what are your personal takes on that? So we'll get your individual positions and then we'll allow you to smack each other around the head with your differing sources that you wish to wave at us.
Yeah, well, I was thinking a lot about it as I was doing that book about Parma, because Parma is so little known, so on the periphery, and there is so much there. In Luce you can find so much about managing the empire, about the a philosophical underpinning of all this administrator, because working really in the archives, which was a great pleasure, by the way. I would like everybody to go to Parma, to these archives where you literally have to blow, the dust of the because so few people go there. I was actually the only non-Parmeans historian doing any serious research there, and so it came to me, what I was asking myself, why would people do that? Why would somebody, an administrator, go to a place where he didn't understand anything? They were so out of touch with what was going there. They were constantly at a sort of risk of manipulation, either by flattery or by all sorts of double dealing and so on. So I was wondering, why would you do that? And certainly it was not for money. The pay was not all that great, and there are other ways to make money. And so I began more and more to think about it. Now, in the end, what's also interesting in Parma is that indeed you can see how the Napoleonic troop, that in military terms, the war was lost because very literally on the same day that the French troops left Parma, the Austrian troops came in and took over, and the same people that said goodbye to the French greeted, so it was so clear that it was a loss. However, while this part certainly speaks of the French losing the military side, the Duchy of Parma continued to be run as a French department, and that kind of prompted me to think what is it that happened? Did the empire? I mean, what is this lasting imprint? That the empire left on Europe. Although, as Napoleon himself said, Waterloo will erase the memory of my victories and so on. But what remains, he said, is a civil code. Now, you always have to take with quite a pinch of salt, don't you? Whatever Napoleon says in his memoirs, but there is something to it, isn't it? That so much as once the wars were over, what Waterloo was over, everything is over, right? From a military point of view, so much remains, and that was our goal in this conference, in this workshop, and indeed I want to underscore what Alex said. It was a very productive days and a lot of conversation, really productive conversation. Nobody left. I mean, it wasn't like you said your paper and leave. Everybody stayed. So I would say that yes, there was a measure of winning. And again, what I would like to underscore that with what the Austrian officers, the representative of the Austrian emperor in Parma, writing about how to manage the Duchy of Parma, wrote literally, but we are not going to even use the word French anymore. So the word French disappeared from the vocabulary. But then they said, in fact, we are not going to destroy all this infrastructure, because why would we do that? Because this functions rather well. And so again, this is a small example, but then I think if we expand the conversation and look in different other places, we are going to find that much that remained was, without using the word French, appreciated and built upon.
Yeah, I think, echoing what Doyna said, I'm reminded of François-René Chateaubriand, who has that famous line when he says that, while alive, Napoleon may have failed to win the world, but dead, he conquered it. And what he means here is both, of course, is both Napoleonic legend and the myth that is so resilient, but more crucially is the legacy, the tangible legacy that outlived a Napoleonic Empire. And here, I think we have the overarching conclusion that you will find in the book and certainly in the papers is that the legitimacy of the French rule and the legacy of it is not simply derived from kind of the right of conquest, but rather it is embedded in the transformative promise that the French effectively represented and in many cases implemented across the empire. And the promise was effectively to challenge the quote-unquote feudal customs and traditions and bring something that we can, in hindsight, equate with modernity. Things like principles of equality, or principles of rational government, and yes, part of it was a notion of civilizing mission, and when we touched on kind of this idea, and this is where Aurélien Lignereux's work is so important, it shows that the empire as this progressive or civilizing entity was not just the product of one, two, or three kind of top individuals. It's not Napoleon kind of his Uberman, kind of superhuman being that is willing it all into reality, but rather it is the efforts of countless administrators, bureaucrats, soldiers, stationed across the empire that translate this theory, this aspiration into a practice, and along the way, what they do is they actually create and manage a web of expectations, and the expectations are, if Doyna kind of goes and occupies the Duchy of Parma, well, she needs to promise certain things in order to make her presence there tolerable, and that is maybe expectation of a career advancement, but it's also more crucially the promise of domestic stability, domestic improvement, and certainly growth. And I think in most cases than not, the French Empire was able to deliver on those promises, and which is why many of its reforms are retained after the empire is gone.
Luke, we can't not bring you in from a memory perspective on this. Winning the peace, is it as simple as the Waterloo gift shop?
You know, it's funny you should say that. The first time I ever met Alex was at a conference, and he was commenting on a paper. I was but a lowly graduate student, and I was talking about Waterloo tourism. And his comment was, you know, if you go to the Waterloo gift shop, it looks like Napoleon won, and he's dead on right. And you know, look, part of we all can admit that the Waterloo Museum is a piece of propaganda, right? You don't put that giant portrait of Napoleon up in front of all the monarchs on a smaller scale unless you're saying something. Nor do you, you know, talk about him bringing in sugar and neglect the mentioned slavery without doing something. But I think there is absolutely something to this winning the peace, and I think partially it is, as you know, both Doyna and Alex have said, right? They are bringing in something that we can look back on with hindsight as a form of modernity, and a lot of it is being kept. And I think that is a crucial part of it, because after you can go 2-3 generations after anyone remembers the slaughter of Austerlitz, of Waterloo. But if it's still suddenly simple for you to deal with the courts because of its reforms introduced by Napoleon's government, then it's suddenly going to take on a much rosier hue. The irony, of course, being that Napoleon was, you know, we talk about Napoleon sort of ending the revolution in a certain way. And one of the things that really motivated the revolution was to fix exactly what Napoleon was trying to fix across Europe, right? As France expands, the way those kings cement their legitimacy is they allow personal rule, they allow individual governments, they allow all of this stuff that creates a modern France that is utterly chaotic, which drives the revolution. And then Napoleon comes in and goes, no, here's a giant code that will bear my name, because of course it will. And you know, and then he exports that in a way, sort of, again, pointing out how different he is from the French monarchs that came before him. But in that, pointing out that for once, he actually had the right of it.
As we've said before, by 1815, the genie is out of the bottle, and everybody realizes that they can't entirely put the genie back in the bottle when it comes to ideas of progress, much though, as we've said, you know, 1815 is as much about sort of trying to turn back the clock as possible without, you know, over-egging it. Alex?
Yeah, you know, kind of reminds me of the story that I very often kind of tells students. It's a story that Louis Madeleine, the great French historian, himself loved to recount. And of course he would, because of, you'll see the kind of the point of it. And it is about the Illyrian provinces, right? It's kind of the periphery of the empire, which Napoleon occupies in 1809, and not simply occupies, but makes integral part of France as new départements. And the French rule these provinces for, shall I say, 4 years, really, until 1814. And so then, of course, the French Empire collapses, and the Habsburgs reclaim Illyrian provinces. And in 1820, Emperor Francis kind of travels to Illyrian provinces, and so he's shown these many interesting places, schools, roads, buildings, and every time he kind of looks at it and he says, "Hey, who built this?" And the answer is the French, sire. And so after a while, he just gets exasperated, and he kind of famously says, "Those French devils would have done well to have remained here a few years longer," because it seems like they did indeed improve, and they've done better than us. So it's not just the memory, which is itself, of course, important. Yeah, and Luke is absolutely right. It's a human nature to forget, I think, after a while, I think the misery of it, and remember the better part of it. But it's also the tangible effects and after effect, kind of legacy of Napoleonic rule, whether it's laws or reforms, or literally in case of Illyria, buildings that are left behind.
Another thing that interested us that's related to that is who was doing all this, all these building reforms and so on, because to be a Napoleonic administrator, you show up there and basically you have to fight against, it was a very uncomfortable position, and I cannot underscore enough the work of Aurélien Lignereux. So especially Les Impériaux, and then other books he did, that he was trying to see what was their experience, what were they doing, what were they thinking, and that I was curious about that too. And you had to have an idea that this makes sense, so you had to have an idea that this will ultimately help. It's very interesting to read some of the private papers of these people who are often despairing and wondering why doesn't anybody understand what's going on. The way they deal with the local population, this kind of making the sausage in a way that's so. That's not always as glamorous, but it's really important to see. So these were the faceless men, as Izervolov called them, the faceless men who built the empire. So, some of the aspects that we also were touching in, how not only did it happen, but how did it happen, and how did it come to last, to endure.
I think if I can maybe jump in and look, if you have, maybe I'm spoiling your master plan here, but kind of to
what
build
else is new, Alex?
Yeah, right. To build on what Doyna is saying is one of the contributions in this book is by Sam Mustafa, who is a wonderful historian of kind of German experiences of Napoleonic Wars, and especially he's written extensively on the Kingdom of Vestalia, and I'm actually looking at his book right here on my shelf called Napoleon's Paper Kingdom. And what Sam kind of talked is Westphalia as an example of this enlightened / revolutionary administrative system, right? So it is efficient, rational, purportedly advantageous to the people that is being imposed upon. And the example that Sam uses in the book is actually a Reichsstag, which is an idea of a national legislature that Napoleon brought, and that is a fresh and new idea for Westphalia, which is itself a fresh and new idea as a state. And Sam shows kind of through the archival research that he's done that this notion of having a national representative institution greatly impressed the Westphalians, and I'm using this kind of course, loosely, kind of Westphalians, both as a new and as a modern, and that it was an institution that for Napoleon effectively was designed to draw a line that would divide kind of the history and experience of the society into pre-Napoleonic and effectively post-Napoleonic, because he could always say, look what I have brought to you. And what he brought would be this representative national institution that is free from quote-unquote feudal constraints of the past. So these are the kind of institutions that are part of Napoleonic legacy.
I want to jump in on this, the whole the faceless government man, but also this legacy here. Because one of the threads running through the various contributions to this volume is what you refer to as the universalism or universality of Napoleon's vision of his empire. Can you unpack that for us?
Well, these are no longer fashionable ideas, right? But we have to remember that they were doing all this at the beginning of 19th century, when the idea of universality was revolutionary. So it was a way of cutting free from the past, from tradition, from everything that was the old regime, and that including communal ties and so on. So it was the idea. But actually, I have to say, for a sort of the book club that we have here, I was just reading Kant and so on. So the idea was that you want to be free of the burden of the past. So this was what was good. This was what was progressive. This was what was revolutionary. And while all these Napoleonic administration are not great philosophers, right? They are not intellectuals. They are not reading and thinking about it all the time. They had enough of an education and they absorb enough of the spirit of the time to believe in. And this is what I found interesting, that they are not of course there is a lot of opportunism and there's a lot of flattery to Napoleon, all that, but beyond all that, so when you take this all away, there was a sincere belief that this is a good thing, that helping the Italians, the Spanish, the Germans, the whoever, to free themselves from their past will open the road to something they call progress. And that's why they constantly gave the example of the French, because they said, well, the French managed to do that, not perfectly, and you still have people who cling to the past, but by and large, we managed to escape. We had this kind of, and if we did it, everybody can do it, and this was the idea of because rationality, what stands to reason, is universal, and what blinds you to reason, to what stands to reason, is your culture, your religion, and everything, the tutelage, the fact that you are still not acting like an adult. And I have to say, it wasn't just the administrator. There are many people on the ground who so I found so they are the Jacobini, so that I did some work on that. They're extremely, actually they were going farther, because often Napoleonic administrators, for pragmatic reasons, had to accommodate. And many of the local pro-revolutionary, so they call themselves Jacobini or patriotic, would be upset. They would say, no, you have to hit the church harder. You don't understand, while often administrators said, well, let's accommodate, so we want peace and quiet and so on. And often they were going farther. There were various kinds of people who kind of disappeared from from historical memory, like various kinds of prefects, local prefects, or lawyers and prosecutors. And so for instance, the imperial prosecutor in Piacenza was constantly saying, you have hit these people hard, because they will thank you later. So there is this kind of idea that somehow you have to. So in conclusion, the idea of universality, when we talk about this, we put it in the historical time, in the historical context. This is the kind of philosophical basis on which they were building their policies. And they were fully in agreement with what was advanced opinion at the time, including in the places that they were ruling, not only among the French.
Yeah, and just to continue Doyna's argument, I think in many ways the starting point would be a sense of superiority, cultural superiority that the French possessed because of the revolution. They genuinely believed that the French system was inherently superior to the one that they were finding in the occupied territories. And so what you see, therefore, here is two processes. One is what shall we call intentional universalism. And that is what Doyna was referring to. And effectively, it's a concept that would be embracing the universalist principles of the French Revolution. I mean, I don't think we can disagree with that, with the notions that liberty, equality, brotherhood, those are the universal principles, right? But on the other hand, right, there is also a companion kind of principle to it, and that is practical particularity, as I sometimes call it. And what practical particularity is, how do we account for vast differences, ethnic, cultural, regional differences that we encounter even within the same quote-unquote country? If we go in Italy, it's one thing that you find in Parma, but it's completely different that you find in Naples, or let's say in Calabria, right? And the certainly Napoleonic experiences in Parma are completely different from those, from the official experiences in Calabria. And here, what you find is something quite interesting. We do talk a lot about Napoleon kind of micromanaging and Napoleon kind of sticking his fingers everywhere. But what he does actually is he sticks fingers on with kind of almost like surgical needs. There are certain things that Napoleon wants, and this is money, troops, right? On those issues, he absolutely will intervene. He will come down all the way to the local official level and demand the stringent conscription quotas, right? But at the same time, there is a great degree of freedom that imperial officials actually have to deal with diverse expectations of local people. So how do you deal with the local needs? How do you deal with the local challenges? And so instead of enforcing a rigid one-size-fit-all system, actually on the local grounds, you oftentimes see Napoleonic officials adopting a very pragmatic approach that is more characterized by adaptation and moderation. And that's the approach that, for example, Lignerot refers to as mesopolitique. And so what mesopolitique effectively means is the politics of the middle level, not the top central government, right? But rather it's the approach in which the imperial officials want to govern the people by reshaping the broader environment through the administrative economic reforms. And those reforms, more often than not, are actually responding to local pressures. So for the listeners, I don't want them to think of Napoleonic Empire being a top-down exclusively. There's a lot of pressure coming up from bottom up, and the empire is savvy enough, capable enough to responding to those pressures. And in our book, Lignerot has a wonderful study of Dubois Aimé, who is one of the imperial officials, his experiences. We also have a great study of Bettina Séverine Barboutis, of one of the imperial officials who is in Grand Duchy of Berg, a guy by the name of Jean-Claude Bignot, who on one hand is clearly a prime example of a French official who genuinely believes in the France's civilizing mission. He believes France is inherently superior, and he does it actually. He imposes this French rule in a rather heavy-handed measure. But on the other hand, we can also look at Christine Haynes' essay in the book that talks about Jean-Maximilien Lamarck, who is a general, but who also understands that in order to win this war, let's say in Spain or in southern Italy, you first need to win hearts and minds. And so his approach to what we now call counterinsurgency is very adaptive to local needs.
The cultural superiority of the French. We should emphasize again for your listeners that the way they think of France being better, superior, having an idea, is precisely because of this universalist idea that somehow, so it's not something inherently French in being different, in coming to to offer progress and modernity and so on. It's because somehow by chance, by a lucky chance, France arrived at this universality first. And in fact, some of Bonaparte's proclamations already in 1796, when he tells the Lombardians, you can have the revolution without the revolution and its crimes. So because we already did it, so why would you go through the same process, with the guillotine and all that and the civil war and stuff like this when we already did it, and here is the final product. You're welcome. But it's not a sort of like we would now understand the sort of French ethnic cultural superiority. It's this kind of philosophical, if you want, superiority as France having embraced, understood, assimilated, worked on universal philosophical enlightenment principles before everybody. Thank you.
Can I stay with the linguistics of this for a moment? Because we're talking here about sort of notions of French cultural superiority. We're talking about, I guess, civilizing, inverted commas, language that sort of punctuates so much of the discussion here. And this is all happening in an environment of conquest. This is also happening at a time when European nations have and continue to be engaged in conquest and then subsequently involved in civilizing missions across various continents of the world, whether it's particularly prominent, quite obviously, in Africa, but also increasingly encroaches into attitudes in India. That's a transitional thing rather than something that's there from the start. But nonetheless, it's very obvious, and it becomes the big story of the 19th century. And I'm very interested about where you see this sitting within all of that, because it's very easy to make those comparisons between the language that's being used. But is this a reflection of the much wider sort of global attitudes to anything that isn't my metropole, that isn't my home country? Or is this something that is kind of growing as an idea in Europe that then post-war is picked up by other nations as, well, this is an idea that Napoleon was using. Why don't we take that and export that and utilize it ourselves? Do you have a sense of what's happening there?
I do. And in fact, I mean, it's of course, there are certain ways of a certain level of gradation, let me put this in these perceptions. I just finished the book on Louisiana Purchase, and I know, for example, that from the French perspective, even Americans were not kind of civilized enough. So kind of they had this kind of suspicious level of uncivilizedness to it, and there is something to be said about, of course, Benjamin Franklin dressing up in raccoon hats and kind of walking around to convey and play up to those expectations and perceptions. And certainly, if you read the French, for example, or the Spanish correspondence, diplomatic correspondence, especially the envoys writing from Washington, they all kind of complain about, even here, kind of ostensibly in former British colonies that are now in a sovereign state, that there is still a degree of civilizing that you can accomplish. Now, think to what degree that sentiment would have been increased to when it comes to, let's say, islands in the Caribbean or Asia or Africa, where these perceptions would have been reinforced through the good old racism, if not, xenophobia. So, if we focus only on Europe, though, right? Even within Europe, I think there is a degree of civilizing superiority and cultural superiority, sense of cultural superiority that you will see. I'll let Doyna talk about the French and Italian experiences, but I mean, even from the Russian perspective, for example, when Russian imperial authorities established in the Caucasus, there is an overt Orientalism there that is meshed up with a sense of cultural superiority and the sense of civilizing mission. anyone reading the correspondence of the first kind of first imperial proconsul, so to speak, Russian governor of Caucasus, will be stunned by the language that he uses, that is overtly racist, and that's towards quote unquote Caucasians, that as Blumenthal argued, right, were the progenitors of the white race. So that's I think there is a complexity to it that is not as straightforward as kind of Europeans or Western Europeans looking at everyone else. There is a degree of inner complexity to it.
Yeah, it's again we have to consider all the discussions that happened all throughout the 18th century on principles of universality, reason, rationality, kind of liberating yourself from the burden of the past. In fact, I think D'Alembert specifically says in his introduction to the preliminary to the encyclopedia that you have to free yourself from the burden of tradition and custom and culture and so on. Let your mind, rationality and so on. And so the French are there, but not all the French. And that's why I think it's worth thinking about in the context of their own intellectual climate. And again, these are not all, they don't sit up all night reading philosophy because they don't have time. They have to read what Napoleon writes, orders and things like that. But there is this kind of understanding, of the universal values that the French arrived there. Not all the French, because remember, there is still the Vendée, right? I mean, it only ends sometimes in what, 1800, 1801, that the first consul manages to make an agreement with the Vendée. But if you read some of the reports that French officers write from the Vendée, one that struck me was that these people really don't understand it, and one said their minds are not made for the truth. They don't get it, So, and these are French, right? They would be French. So that's to what extent their minds begin to understand the truth, the truth of these universal values, and then we can talk. Now, with Italy, again, there is this concept among the French of Italians having left history, taken a vacation from history for a while, and now they were brought back. It's like a Sleeping Beauty. There is the marvelous first pages of Stendhal's Chartreuse de Parme, where he says literally that once the French came, everybody just opened, the scale fell off people's eye. And Stendhal, because Stendhal says everything was flooded by light, So, and this was the hope, I think, of many of these administrators, that people will just open their eyes to, to the light, the truth, the universal value of these principles of government and so on. So it's philosophy brought to on earth, but I think it's interesting, it's very complex, right? Debate that continues, and somehow the seeds were put there by the debates that were taking place, especially in the German lands. And so I would remind you of Fichte, since we talk about Jena, because Fichte was in Jena, right? And while he was initially supporter of Bonaparte, and he turned against him, and 13 addresses to the German people, to the German nation, are debating exactly this. But they say, well, maybe in one I think that there are 13 of them, but in one of them he says quite explicitly that maybe the ideas that the French bring are more rational, or there is something to that, but we are Germans, right? So we have our own way of doing things, and so that's the entire debate. Is the I don't know, category A way of doing things, because it is more, say, rational, to the naked reason, better than ours, which is just ours. So I think this kind of debate between universal principles and how do we call it, cultural systems of meaning, kind of starts there. So I would. So they already started thinking about that. And of course, then is the second level to what extent this universal values, even those who believed in them, began to weaponize them, right? To use them really as forms of exploitation and oppression and so forth. That was as far from philosophy as possible. But the debate, I would say, started in this context of Napoleonic administration.
I want to jump in on this and the whole, sort of, they don't understand it because they're not French. They don't understand it because they are French, and the resistance back and forth. And several of your chapters really demonstrate how, quote unquote, defeated countries or forced into allyship countries weaponize their own culture to resist French hegemony. Both in the sort of, musical pieces about French defeat, classic, we're going to sing songs about the enemy, but also in that sort of, how dare they do this? Don't they know that our culture is superior? We're going to resist that way. So I want to hear you talk a bit more about that, and also basically just give you the opportunity to keep talking about what you're talking about, because it flows in so beautifully.
I was reminded that I made a note for myself. There is a beautiful letter from Pietro Verri, who was an eminent personality of the Italian Enlightenment, to his brother Alessandro in 1796, as the first Italian campaign is on the way, and the sister republics and so on. And so he writes, so these are two prominent intellectual Enlightenment, Italian intellectual in Milan. And so Pietro asks his brother Alessandro, will we ever be able to live in freedom, in liberty? So will this be successful, in other words? Because we are so tied to our history, we are still fighting the Guelph and the Ghibellines. Will we be able to go? So there is a debate among local intellectuals about that. Now, Maximilian Novak's chapter here and is talking about the other side of the coin, where people who feel offended by that. And said we had, and as I mentioned, Fichte, he addresses it in these addresses to the German nation. I think that it depended, of course, to what extent you believed what the French believed. To what extent you believed that these principles were indeed universal, applicable everywhere, and hence adaptable to various kinds of local culture, or if you believe that this was just the ruse of the French to have their way. And some of the Germans, the German intellectual believed it, others don't. But I think even in the way they fight the French is also a search for universal principles. Just saying it's not just the French. We also arrived there by other means. But I think the debate was happening, and we have to give credit in a way to Napoleon and his people, because they kickstarted it. I'm not sure they would have had it without being forced into it, in a sense. So, in other words, there is opportunity in crisis, and I think that many found the opportunity to reflect on these ideas because they were pushed to the wall.
Yes, I think there's so many kind of moving elements in this question that, and it's really fascinating question to contemplate on. If nothing else, I mean, it brings to my mind, the activities of, let's say, Brother Grimm, who, of course, published the first edition of their stories in 1812. And of course, they are just 10 years old in 1796 when war comes, so to speak, to Germany, right? When the French armies are now strong enough to actually push eastward and increasingly expand their conquests. So, what is it that drives Brother Grimm's to venture out into the small villages and regions of Germany and collect those folk tales? Sure, part of it is kind of response to Napoleonic maybe occupation, but part of it, of course, is the sense of romanticism that is emerging independent of Napoleon. There is, but going back to the kind of question that you raised, Luke, is that of course France is in many ways the first one to, shall I say, invent. Certainly experimented with a modern nationalist political program. Revolutionaries did that, right, and then did so through effectively using or harnessing the power of public education. There is a wonderful study, the Geography of France, I think it's called. Oh no, the Discovery of France, where the opening chapter is beautifully written about the geographers from the Cassini's expedition that are sent to measure and study France's countryside, and they are killed because they are just outsiders and foreigners, so that the locals don't want the central government to know about them. They can't even understand them. Well, the French Revolution challenges that by actually bringing the French, what we now count French language, to the country folk, and by creating, if nothing else, nationally, linguistically, and culturally unified national area. Is that a good thing? Well, in hindsight, some of us maybe will find that as a good thing. But what if you are living in Germany, where the regional character is strong enough and you attach to it? Maybe your livelihood is dependent on it, and there is certainly a debate on what exactly is, let's say, German or Italian. We certainly know in hindsight that it will take a few generations and several rounds of wars to figure out that, let's say, in the Italian case, Italian is a Sardinian or Roman version of it, and German case, German is a Russian, has a Prussian flavor to it. What I find interesting in all of this is, of course, the response, as complex as it is very diverse. So in the Russian case, Napoleon's invasion of Russia, of course, incites not, let's say, shall I say, civic version of nationalism, but in the sense of nationalism that is deeply infused with religion. The response in Russia is more of a doubling down on your religious sense of exclusiveness, the sense of the threat that is not just political and social, but also existential. Right? They genuinely believe, at least on the level of a folk, kind of on a rural population, and the church plays a very important role in this, in convincing people that what the French will do is corrupt our way of life. They will take it away. And why they do it? Well, because they're heathens, they're atheists, they are kind of driven by Satan himself. So that's a different type of nationalism, let's say, than the nationalism that we oftentimes ascribe to, let's say, in Germany, where it has a more a sense of unity that is prevalent among the intelligentsia, and writers like Schiller or like Fichte, who talk about the German unity, but certainly in a theoretical more level than a practical. And of course, another type of response would be exemplified in Spain, as our good friend Charles Esdale has shown. The Spanish response is not universal, embracing nationalism, but even Spanish nationalism it differs in its ultimate goal. Is it nationalism as in fighting against the French to bring back Bourbon monarchy, or is it a nationalism to oppose the threat and bring something new, shall we say, independent Cortés? Or is it as Doyna was alluding to, the afrancesados, who are no doubt Spanish patriots who believe that embracing Constitution of 1808 is actually a good thing for Spain. So I think it's a way to say that Napoleon opens a big can of worms, nationalist worms, that the rest of the 19th century tries to kind of deal with.
I want to pick up on something that you were discussing earlier, which is still relevant to this, and it's this sort of dichotomy between idealism and pragmatism, and why quite where the needle lands in terms of which themes emerge varies. This is something that folks have had inflicted on them many times from a legal perspective, because legal scholars have known for probably the last 50 years, if not even longer, that there has always been a hugely pragmatic element in the application of the law, and yet the law is often crafted with idealism in mind. And I'm very curious when it comes to resistance, whether there are things that we can learn about the inclination towards pragmatism, and whether there are certain environments, I guess, in which pragmatism will thrive in the face of idealism, and how people choose how they're going to navigate these, and the responses that individuals have, and lots of different things that are emerging during this time.
Oh yeah, I think actually, as soon as you started kind of talking about that, it brought to my mind Jonathan Sperber, who's a great historian of the 19th century. He has this wonderful passage where he says that, and I'll try to remember if the quote, just not maybe 100%, but I think the quote is, "Nationalism was the experience of marching behind the tricolor flag, of large-scale collective singing, of joining in public meetings or small conspirational circles." And I like that kind of vision of it, because in many ways that was the nationalism for many Germans, many Italians. Think about the Carbonari movement. What is nationalism to them? It's getting, I guess, in a small conspiratorial circle and envisioning a better Germany. Or think about the German nationalists, who many of them are young students, certainly in the 1820s, if not a little later, who do exactly what Jonathan writes about. They get behind marching the tricolor flag and sing nationalist songs, thinking that, hey, just this is their sense of nationalism. The problem, of course, is that the nationalist goals in Central Europe, in the wake of Napoleon, are articulated and furthered by a wide range of kind of groups of people and movements. Some liberal, some radical, and eventually quite a few conservative. And they have a contrasting visions of it. So it really depends on which type of nationalism we talk about. But if there is one commonality among them, is that they're all aspirational. They are kind of idealist in how they envision their nations.
Yeah, well, and indeed, context. I mean, the local realities also matter, because it's interesting after the fall of Napoleon in Italy, and that's something that I found very interesting about Italian historiography. They're much kinder, even those who are very critical to Napoleon. They are much kinder to the entire Napoleonic era, because there is a large consensus that without Napoleon there would not be Italy, right? So that it brought this idea of common values, of something, that they can build on and so on, leaving aside but very 1796 that, the Campanilismo and so on. Now Germany would be similar with Italy from this point of view. There are disparate regions with strong local cultures and so on, but I don't have so yeah, that's actually, now I'm thinking that would be a good line of reflection. Why is Germany not Italy? There was all this discussion after 1945. Why is Germany not England, right? So why is Germany not Italy? Because why does it respond so differently to Napoleonic pressures? Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I would think that in various kinds of political alignments, they consider themselves patriots, nationalists, and whether it was expressed through songs and flags or whatever, or some sort of project. The idea was to make it better. Now, you could make it better by embracing the universal values that the French generously offered in exchange for small, taxation, conscription, and so on, because, freedom is not free, is it? Or you could do it just finding your own. Just think of the monument, and this is for Luke, who is so interested in images, right, and memory. Just think of the monument in Leipzig, that is done to be as not French as possible. Right? So then that is, it's absolutely horrendous. If you have you been there? Have you seen it? It's an absolute horror. It's an absolute horror.
You're just scoring our German listeners, Doyna.
No. I mean, okay. It is done to be very somber and certainly not joyful, and you don't feel like smiling approaching it. And everything about that monument is to express German unity, German culture that is absolutely category explicitly not French, right? But it is, however, in reaction to the French. So it's jumping off, responding to the French. Now, what do you think? Because as we were talking, I remember Pierre Nora, the historian Pierre Nora, who I had the great pleasure of being in the room when he uttered one of his maxims that then was reproduced in different books, that France has universality in its particularity. Get that? So what is French is universal. Hence, you can... So I think that was probably the underlining philosophy, for a lot of French Napoleonic people and those who agreed with them. And many disagreed and then fought against. Hence,
Leave it to the French historian to say that what makes France special is something that everyone can learn from.
Yeah.
And yes, the monument in Leipzig is, I think, the best phrase for it, if we want to go away from horrendous, is Teutonic.
Yeah.
It is the most explicitly Teutonic thing I have ever seen. No, my pleasure. And I just want to remind our listeners, this is something that Alex and Doyna will they don't think to utter it because they know it so instinctively. But when Sperber says nationalism is marching behind the tricolor, we all instinctively think of France. But across the 19th century, revolutionary movements in Italy, in Germany, in Belgium, and in France all marched behind tricolors. Different tricolors. But there is a reason that flag's design took on a bit of universality of its own, and I think it is, again, a little bit to do with Nora and that, what is the universality of the particularity of the French. All right. There's a lot of fascinating stuff here, and honestly, when I was writing the questions for this, what I really wanted to do was pitch Zach on a roundtable on here with all of the participants, but that would just be reproducing the conference again, or the workshop again, which is probably a bit of a difficult sell. But one of the plaster elephants of the Bastille in the room here is gender. Most explicitly, the Code Napoleon is a significant step back for women. But the barracks that Princi and the salons that Hicks explore are also gendered spaces. And I'm reminded of Beatrice de Graaf on this very podcast, referring to dismissing Napoleon as a misogynistic prig. So how does Napoleon's enlightened governance, and indeed his entire legacy, fare when examined through the lens of gender?
All right. I don't think so. This is where I'm not in favor of castigating them, because the standard of the day was that. I mean, looking back from the modern hindsight, of course, all of them were misogynist. Has anyone read Founding Fathers' correspondence? I think they will be quite aghast about some of the things they've said, including about women, not to mention about slaves or Native Americans. I don't think that Napoleon's misogyny, which is quite pronounced, is any different than other kind of late 18th century Enlightenment male. Sure, for you can always find some progressive voices here and there, but I think overall the society was so deeply ingrained in patriarchy that I'm not surprised to hear that Napoleon had some critical views of women, and certainly had a very difficult relationship with quite a few of them. Not the least Germaine de Stael, who he famously disliked. So I take it as part and parcel of being in 18th century.
I would disagree with the misogynist, sexist. Yeah, I agree with Alex that it's the time. We have to remember where they live. But also, if you look in the kind of gender roles, I remember even the revolution failed to give women the right to vote, although there had been very vigorous debates about that, and you find many of the speeches and so on made in the National Assembly and up to the Constituent Assembly, rather to convention, pardon me. They could be written now. So there was a debate, and there was a trend of thought that went to full political equality and so forth. Now Napoleon was not personally the type to fall into that category. However, if you look at the way the kind of roles that he assigned to the wives of his administrators, for instance, the way he thought about it, and he saw that the wives had a very important part to play. He actually wrote letters to the wives. I had a conference paper where I researched a little bit Junot, and the way he wrote to Madame Junot and said, well, this is what you should do. Make sure that you help your husband, that you do that, and you do that and the other thing, that you meet with the wives. That So there were a lot of tasks, that were that women were entrusted with. Within indeed the gender separation and so on, but I don't think it was contempt or really disbelief in women's quality. It's just a completely different way of thinking about gender. But I think that he believed that there was a lot of this kind of soft power, political power that women could have. So I would suggest to maybe expand a little bit this his views on gender and what women role in society. So of course, he is famous for being so absolutely beastly with Madame de Stael, and he could not stand, anybody to criticize him. So he himself might have been that, but in his personal life. But I think that women could exercise a certain amount of agency. And we are going back. So I promise you that Aurélien Lignereux does not know that we keep praising him, bringing up his name. But in his book about Les Impériaux, he also has a chapter about women, wives, mothers, sisters, who accompanied the administrators and who took on a lot of the task of administering, governing, winning hearts and minds and all that. So I think it's more nuanced a little bit than just sexism.
I completely agree with Doyna in that I would kind of contextualize it to say maybe was Napoleon or any of his marshals or officials more misogynistic than, I don't know, Wellington or Nelson or Emperor Alexander of Russia. I think there is a misogyny was deeply embedded in the 18th century society. It's patriarchal. It's convinced that men are superior and that women as emotional and dependent beings, destined for domestic functioning as quote unquote second sex. So I think even during the French Revolution, with the debates about the women's rights, there's plenty of misogyny that is going around. So, and it is in that context that I really kind of looking at Napoleon as a byproduct of his period and time.
I suspect we could do with having a debate on precisely that topic and bringing Beatrice on and all of us getting our teeth into that. Sadly, we are going to call a halt on this discussion here. But folks, you've been listening to Doyna or Diana, according to Starbucks, Hassanyi, professor of history at Central Michigan University, author of French Rule in the States of Parma, 1796 to 1814, working with Napoleon, which is available from Palgrave Macmillan, and Alexander Mikaberidze, professor of history at Louisiana State University, Shreveport. And if you haven't picked up a copy of the Napoleonic Wars of Global History or Kutuzov, A Life in War and Peace, then we have failed you somehow, because we mention it often enough. Links to both of those will, of course, be in the description. But crucially, you've been hearing a discussion around their latest collaboration, Napoleonic governance and the integration of Europe, managing the empire, winning the peace. Again, we will put a link to the description. You can get it from Palgrave Macmillan. And if you've enjoyed this discussion, then I'm sure you will love the contributions in the various chapters of that. Alex, Doyna, it's been an absolute joy to have you on. Thank you so much for your time and for such a kind of deepened and thought-provoking discussion that we've enjoyed over the last 75 minutes. It certainly made me get the grey matter working, which doesn't happen often enough, quite frankly, on this show. Folks, you've been listening to the Napoleonic Wars pod. We will be back very soon. Got a question? Disagree with something we've said? Then post in the comments section and we'll get back to you. Remember to like and hit the follow button so that you never miss an episode. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, and much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in early February 2026, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice DeGraff, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Ruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, Wojciech Stefanovic, Simon Weathers, John, Zach Johnson, Matthew Turner, Rich Payne, Edward Gilhead, Vic Martindale, Adam Coslin, Tessa Blaber, Nick Beckstrom, Stephen Walker, John Parkin, John Henneken, Stephen Dicey, and the Bald Monk. The Admiral patrons: John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, John and Casey Randolph, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, Darla Vincent, Rob Painter, JC Kaiser, Graham Swidenbank, Nikia Craig, The Iron Duke, and Plastic Tash. And in the Crown Yourself tier: Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell, Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell, Chosen Man Graham, Child of Wellington Brian Silcott, First Lord of the Treasury Ryan Diamond, Portrait Prince of Pukalani Bob Burnham, General Alexander Suvorov Seth Hansen, and Too Jacobin to Crown Oneself Dan Hazelwood. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke and Louis, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.